Welcome back to The Shed. Today I would like to share with you the 2009 Hugo Award winning novel by Neil Gaiman, the young adult fiction novel, Graveyard Book. Now I read this one on Kindle, so I'll be holding up today the actual graphic novel adaptation, which I think is just absolutely wonderful novel, full of wonderful illustrations that if you get an opportunity to find this one, I highly recommend you pick it up. It's truly a wonderful piece of work. So what I would like to do is provide a bit of a plot overview, talk to what I liked, what I didn't like, I'll make some recommendations, I'll put it to the memory test and we'll rank it on our ever-growing sci-fi shed ladder where I've been ranking all these novels. So it doesn't take long for Neil Gaiman to throw us straight into a horrific three-person homicide. And we find that the sole survivor is this little toddler who happened to climb out of his crib and walk down the street as his family was getting murdered. He happens to stumble his way into a local graveyard while this man called Jack follows him with this, blood-stained knife. Now, what's rather interesting is that the inhabitants of this cemetery, these ghosts, in particular a Mrs. Owens, sees the young boy and automatically says, we've got to take care of this little boy. We can't let him fall prey to this monster here. And starts having conversations with the rest of the graveyard inhabitants, basically saying, yes, I understand that he's human, but we've got to give him the privilege of the graveyard and we've got to protect this little boy. And as they're arguing with the rest of the graveyard community, this big stallion, this big horse comes in with this woman on the back of him amidst them all, and basically says, hey, look, even the dead should have charity. And all of a sudden it's consensus being formed, and they take this little boy in as part of the graveyard community. They look at this little boy, try to figure out what shall we call this little guy, and they decide on the name Nobody Owens, as in nobody owns him, or he doesn't look like nobody else, and he goes by the name of Bod Owens, Nobody Owens. So in the tradition of the Jungle Book, we find Bod Owens is raised by these people in the graveyard, and we learn about his different adventures in the graveyard, exploring the place, which was just awesome. We learn about his struggles trying to go to school and trying to make friends in the real world, as well as this ever-present threat to his life. So look, I found it to be a very enjoyable read, this one. So what is there to like in particular about this one? Look, I'd have to say it's Neil Gaiman's writing. He has got such a wonderful illustrative way of writing that really lends itself to these wonderful graphic novels, right? Now, the book that I read, the young adult version of the book, is about 200 to 300 pages, somewhere around there, which I read on Kindle, and it's a non-graphic novel. But the writing is so graphical in nature that you can just see it come to life. You can almost envision every single part of this graveyard and what it would look like. You can envision these characters and what they would look like, which I think makes it up for a perfect adaptation in what we have in the the graphic novel adaptation, because it really is that writing that P. Craig Russell, who illustrated this novel, didn't have to really think much. It's so wonderfully illustrated in writing that it just makes for a perfect graphic novel at that, and one that I highly recommend. It's a wonderful, really wonderful novel. So I really like that illustrative writing, but I also really like the fact that, even though it can be a bit bleak and dark in this graveyard at times, there's always a glimmer of hope, and I really enjoyed that in the writing as well. The other thing I really enjoyed were the characters. I mean, the characters just jump out of the page at you in this and come to life. So similar to the setting and the graveyard, I think the characters also just come to life with the descriptive writing of them. So I really enjoyed the characters. I thought they didn't go through any particular huge character arc like you would expect in a young adult fiction novel, but I just found them to be really enjoyable characters as well. So I really enjoy Neil Gaiman's voice. He's got a really interesting, humorous, sometimes scary and altogether wonderful way of writing that I thoroughly enjoyed in this one. So what is there not to like in Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book? Look, I think if you're coming in understanding that you're reading a young fiction, adult fiction piece of work, you're going to be fine. But there are 2 points I would like to make that may take away from your enjoyment if you didn't understand that coming in. One of them is that the novel is written in a short story format, in the sense that every time young Owens jumps up a year and he gets a year older, we're introduced to a new setting and a new character and a new adventure. And it all sort of works well and is sort of loosely coupled to make it coherent, but it's not what you'd expect in a typical novel. So I'd have to say that for it. You may be a little bit put off by that. It wasn't my personal experience, but I thought I would highlight it here. The other bit is, I would say, is don't look too deeply into the motivations of Jack. I think under deep scrutiny, you find that his argument as to why he wants to get Nobody Owens sort of doesn't quite make sense. Again, in a young adult setting, I can sort of appreciate it. It's a novel, it's a piece of fiction. But under scrutiny, as an adult, I don't think that argument quite as sort of holds. But look, that's a minor nitpick because it didn't really take away from my enjoyment. So when it comes to the memory test, the first time I read this back in 2009, I actually didn't know that this was a piece of young adult fiction. So regardless of what I said, I don't think it will take away from your enjoyment of this one coming in cold. But I do feel that if you do know that it's a piece of young adult fiction, I think it will enhance your reading experience. The other thing I remember clearly is the imagery of the graveyard and these characters. I mean, as I started reading this, it was quite some time back now. I clearly remembered all the characters. I clearly remembered his adventures, and I clearly remember enjoying the novel thoroughly. So it was no disappointment this time around. It's just a really enjoyable read, and that was my key takeaway from reading it all those years ago. I have to say that this is the first time I read the actual graphic novel as well, on the back of me rereading the novel for the board. And I'd have to say that my recollection of the graveyard and the setting is not influenced by the graphic novel, but by the writing in itself. It is very wonderful writing that really does evoke that sense of realism. You can actually see this graveyard, right, in your mind, which is thoroughly attributed to the writing and not to the necessarily being influenced by the graphic novel. So when it comes to recommendations, look, I highly recommend this to both young adults and adults alike. I think it's one of those novels that really does bridge that gap, and one that can be enjoyed by everyone. In particular, if you like The Jungle Book growing up, or if you're a fan of The Jungle Book today, I'd say have a go at Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. I read multiple interviews online where he openly admits to being influenced by The Jungle Book, and I don't think you'll be disappointed in this one. The other obvious recommendation, and one that we've yet to review on our Sci-Fi Shed Ladder, that should do pretty well, will be J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter book. So if you liked Harry Potter, I can see you would enjoying this one as well. It got those themes of, sometimes dark and sometimes magic elements that you would expect in J.K. Rowling's work, which I think are just wonderfully done in Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book as well. We've got to rank it on our Sci-Fi Shed Ladder. This will be the first time we've ranked a young adult piece of work, so it'll be really interesting to see where this one lands. I would love for you to join me. So back to the Shed Ladder and ranking today's Hugo Award winning novel for 2009, Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. It's going to be interesting to see where this one lands when I apply my full criteria, which I've documented below, on what is a young adult piece of work. Because this is the first that we've covered to date on the board, so it's going to be interesting to see where it lands. But when I look at things like the concept and the execution, this one got near full marks. I really enjoyed that concept of this boy being brought up Jungle Book style in a graveyard and life within a graveyard with all these wonderful characters. So the concept, execution and characters got really high marks. Where it lost some percentage points was around the plot and the writing, and I'll talk to those in my dislike section. But again, where this one's shown was in the memory test. This was just very memorable novel, and I think it comes down to the illustrative writing that Neil Gaiman's so good at. So it's going to be interesting to see where it lands. I thought a good place to start would be Rite of Passage, because that's also a coming-of-age novel, but it tackles a completely different theme. It really does go into those moral and ethical arguments. So it's just nowhere in Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. And very much an adult novel, that one. But I did see similarities in that coming-of-age story, but I'm going to have to give it to Rite of Passage. When it comes to the other ones on the board, I think among others is another interesting one by Joel Walton, because that was also a coming-of-age novel. This lady, this young woman who was really loving science fiction and trying to find her cuirass, as those who watched my review would remember. So she was just trying to find her place in the world, and that definitely reminded me of The Graveyard Book. But I've got to say, as much as I love that love affair and that love letter to science fiction, I think the writing in Neil Gaiman's novel here is slightly stronger. I thought the characters were slightly stronger. And I'll say that it's a much more memorable novel. So having considered my full criteria and other novels similar to that on the list, I've made up my mind. And I'm going to put it just above Among Others by Joel Walton, which is a very great place to be on the board, on the B-side, right in the middle of the bunch of what is an absolutely wonderful set of series of novels that we've got on the board so far. So there you have it. Have you read Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book? Have you read any other Neil Gaiman? I've read quite a fair bit of Neil Gaiman over the years. I do enjoy his writing and his graphic novel adaptations. I think they're just wonderful. But I'd love to hear your opinions. Do you think it justifies its place on the board? I mean, it's been some pretty big heavy lifters in the genre, but I do enjoy this one. Sometimes it's good not to take life too seriously and take a look at something that doesn't need to be complicated and still give you a very good reading experience. And that was my experience reading Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope to see you next time in the shed.